They called it a counter-crusade and believed it would be swift. In the ash-choked light of Isstvan V, banners of vengeance snapped in the bitter wind, and the sons of the Emperor came down in ordered waves like a storm that had finally found a shore. The Iron Hands marched with iron certainty, the Salamanders with the slow-burning patience of the forge, the Raven Guard with knives of shadow honed for a single killing blow. Behind them came the scarred remnants of those already purged by their own brothers, the loyal sons who had survived Isstvan III. Not whole legions, but hard fragments of truth that could still cut. They brought oaths and battle hymns and a promise that treachery would be paid for in full. They did not yet know they were descending into a valley dug by lies, where the ground itself had been measured for graves. Drop pods tore the sky and bit into the black earth, disgorging demigods into a furnace of noise. Titans strode like walking cathedrals, exhaling suns. Artillery stitched the horizon with burning seams. Stormbirds banked and screamed and fell away lighter by 100 warriors each. Vox across the plain throbbed with clipped confirmations, with the steady cadence of range, bearing, raider fire, with prayers that were not called prayers because they were spoken by Astartes. They pressed forward. This is how victory begins, thought more than one of them, with clarity, with momentum, with the enemy fixed and dying. There were no doubts on that first run of minutes, only the practiced hunger of legions who had ended 1,000 wars and would end this one too. The traitor vanguard met them and bled. Sons of Horus in sea-green plate broke beneath hammers and meltifier. Death Guard pushed their phalanxes into the teeth of flame and were hurled backward on blackening boots. World Eaters came in screaming knots and were cut apart in disciplined arcs. The Emperor's children fought with Baroque cruelty and found, to their surprise, that perfection ran thin when iron struck bone. Amid that storm, Ferrus Manus was a moving anvil, each blow a forge breaker shuddering through armor and into the sinful hearts that wore it. Vulkan was an unquenchable blaze, his warriors building fire where the air was already ash. Corvus Corax slipped through the melee like the last shadow of a dying sun, striking where sight could not hold him and leaving silence behind. The first hour was a ledger kept by Loyalists, and every mark was a debt extracted. They were told to hold a little longer. They were told reinforcement banners had crested the ridgeline and were deploying, legions sent to seal the throat of the traitor host. They looked up to the hills that cupped the Urgall Depression, and for a second there was a stillness, the hush of a theater when the curtain begins to rise. They saw the color of new standards in the wind, the geometry of reserves slotting into the pattern of victory. They saw salvation. Guns turned, banners unfurled to show old sigils in a new light. The Iron Warriors set their batteries and chained them to the valley below. The Night Lords came down with laughter like broken glass. The word-bearers took the lips with their sermons and took the flanks with their bolters. The Alpha Legion did what the Alpha Legion always does, and no one can say in what color they fired first. Vox went bright with a dozen voices at once and then went dark under the weight of screaming. The valley became a bowl, and from its rim the traitors poured iron and deceit until the bowl ran red. No plan survived the first betrayal. Ferrus Manus roared for the push to continue. If forward was peril, backward was death. The Raven Guard tried to flow and found the air full of knives. Salamanders locked shields and made firewalls that were also funeral pyres. Loyalists who had been advancing and measured bounds discovered the bounds were boundaries, discovered that every lane they had charted was an avenue for artillery that now struck their backs. Units folded not for lack of courage, but because courage has a geometry, and the enemy had redrawn the map. The killing was methodical, and then it was ecstatic, and then it became a kind of work. Night Lords hunted stragglers for the simple economy of terror. Iron Warriors used the valley floor as a template and practiced the old art of annihilation by enfilade. Word-bearers sang with their mouths and with their guns. The Alpha Legion appeared inside Loyalist perimeters like a thought that should never have been thought. It is easy to say massacre and be done with it. It is harder to narrate the way a line fails, not at a single point, but along its entire length, as if a hand pressed down on the map and smudged 1,000 men into one blurred stain. Harder still to say how a warrior who has never fled looks at his brother's muzzle and understands in a heartbeat that honor has no angle of fire. Somewhere amid that deepening night, Fulgrim found Ferrus Manus. It was not the duel that the epics would later give to children, no clean circle, no cheering ring of armored witnesses, but a collision in a storm where other gods died at the edges of vision. Iron met artifice. Forge-breaker rang on a blade that wore a soul like a mirror. They spoke, or perhaps they did not. Perhaps the words were only in the clatter of teeth behind plates, and the flashing of old memories in the soft places of their minds. It ended as it ends when brothers become equations. One is solved by the other. Fulgrim's stroke cut the world along a line that included a neck, and Ferrus Manus fell headless into legend. The Iron Hands felt it like a signal running through a wire, felt the current surge and then collapse into black. They continued to fight because that is what they were made to do. But something essential snapped, and a machine with a broken spring cannot keep true time. The Raven Guard died with terrible efficiency. Shadow can save you from the eye, but it cannot save you from horizons already seeded with guns. Corax led breakouts that opened like knife slits and then stitched shut with blood behind him. He carried sons on his back and threw them toward ramps that were only briefly ramps, and then were impact craters filling with screaming. In a war of minutes, he measured seconds and found that seconds could still be spent. When he reached orbit with a sliver of his legion, he took with him a new kind of silence. The Salamanders held. It is an unfashionable verb, and it does not sing, but it is the right one. They held around their primarch as around a furnace in a winter that had no end. Vulkan's voice was the thunder inside a mountain. His hammer fell, and hope fell with it, and yet remained, because hope is not a number, it is a posture, and they would not kneel. Flame curled and crawled and scoured. Promethean hearts burned on after armor went dim. When eventually Vulkan was lost, some say buried beneath a collapsing bastion, some say borne away by knighted hands, his sons did not break, so much as thin, each man a filament still glowing in the wind. Elsewhere on the plain, Titans burned. Walkers with names older than some cities took their last strides and were found afterward by carrion servitors praying with static to hot skeletons. Land raiders with tallies carved into their hides settled with the finality of monuments. Apothecaries exhausted their stocks, and then the rituals that make stocks unnecessary, and then their voices, and then the difference between prayer and procedure. Chaplains preached against despair and discovered that despair does not argue, it devours. Librarians reached into the warp for any lever to move the day, and found only teeth. And still, in the crevices of catastrophe, courage grew like weeds. A Raven Guard sergeant carried an injured salamander in one arm and a stolen standard in the other, limping through a corridor that had once been a trench and would soon be a river. An Iron Hand with a shattered augmetic laid down covering fire for men he had teased 100 times for their slow human reflexes. A salamander refused to die until the civilians he had found, children in ash masks from a labor camp no one had even known existed, were sealed in an escape pod. And when the pod would not launch, he carried it on his back until someone made room. These did not save the day. The day was not a thing that could be saved, but they saved the part of the story that would otherwise have been only arithmetic. The second hour was worse than the first, because understanding had arrived. The third hour was worse than the second, because understanding had hardened into the knowledge that no relief was coming. Vox discipline died, and in its place came honest words, the small ones that lose their way on parades and find it again on battlefields. Brother, here, now. A Night Lord walked through a field of bodies and switched off helmets one by one, not for mercy, but for the quiet. An Iron Warrior calculated angles of fire against a knot of Loyalists and admired for a moment the beauty of the line they drew with their lives. Word-bearers wrote scripture with Promethium. Alpha Legionnaires stripped corpses of identifiers and stitched themselves deeper into the fabric of the route, to be discovered later, when a familiar kindness became a fatal angle. When dusk finally pretended to fall, not that the Ashlands of Isstvan V truly knew day or night, the plain was a geometry of wreckage. The Urgall Depression had done its work. The traitor counterattack rolled in deliberate waves, clipping off pockets, collapsing salients, mulching barricades that had been men and metal together. Loyalist Vox that still worked coughed coordinates that were graves under other names. In orbit, ships that had believed they would resupply revolution instead crammed their holds with the remnant. Blood, silence, men who had forgotten how to remove their helmets. The ones who stayed planetside anchored last stands that did not aim at victory, but at meaning, and that is a different calculus entirely. They sang, some of them. They laughed, a few. They killed, because that was what the enemy required to be slowed. And then they died, because that was what the enemy required to be satisfied. It ended not with a trumpet, but with a syntax error. The sentence of battle ran out of words. The traitors stood amid the heat ghosts and counted what they had purchased. Horus had not merely won, he had edited the Loyalist Legions with fire until only fragments remained. Ferrus Manus lay colder than iron and weightier than a planet's moon in the memory of those who had loved him. Vulkan's fate slid between versions as it began. Corax, streaked with the smoke of his own dead, looked down at his hands and saw not talons, but the future, long, thin, and built for slipping through cracks that were not supposed to exist. In the years to come, remembrancers would paint the Dropsite Massacre as the moment when the heresy bared its teeth, but that is too clean. What happened on Isstvan V was the moment when the idea of unity became a superstition men still mouthed because the alternative was too large to swallow. Before that valley, the Imperium had been a choir singing one song in 1,000 keys. After it, the choir remembered the song, but could not find the note. Every world that heard about Isstvan V counted its fleets twice. Every commander looked at his second and saw a coin spinning in the air. Every oath from then on was heavier because it had to drag the memory of a brother turning. They would say later that the Emperor was still on the throne and that the light of the Astronomicon still ran like a golden river through the void. They would say the tools remained, the legions still marched, the sigils had not been repainted. All of that was true, but truth after Isstvan V had a taste of iron in it. On that ash plain, the War Master proved that a map of strength could be folded back on itself until strength cut strength. On that day, the sons of the Emperor learned that there is a shape to betrayal and that it can be mass-produced. The Imperium would fight on, fiercely, magnificently, monstrously. But somewhere in its architecture, a hairline crack had become a fault, and generations yet unborn would fall into it. The ash settled. The air cooled from scream to whisper. Servitors dragged the last usable plates from wrecks and stacked them for inventories that would never be completed. On the ridgeline, the banners that had turned once hung limp in the lazy wind, their colors uncertain in the failing light. A survivor, one of too few, picked up a tag from the mud and wiped it clean with the back of a gauntlet that would never quite stop shaking. He did not know whose name it showed. Perhaps no one would now. He slipped it into a pouch and moved on, because moving on was the only verb left. Far above, ships shifted on their vectors, some toward the War Master's gathering night, some toward the Emperor's burning heart, all of them smaller than they had been. The valley waited for a new name, but it did not need one. Those who had been there would carry it with them into every silence that followed. When they spoke of Isstvan, they would not talk first about tactics or banners or the catalogue of who fired when. They would talk about the moment the guns on the hill turned. They would talk about the breath between recognition and impact, about how long a heartbeat can last when the future is falling into it. And they would talk, quietly, about how from that heartbeat onward, the Imperium did not truly believe in itself, not the way it had the day before. It would still fight. It would still conquer. It would still bleed enough to drown empires. But the chorus would always carry a note of doubt, thin as a hair and sharp as a blade. And under the greatest victories, there would always be the sound of banners turning in a distant wind.